Hi, I'm Shan Wu with an Undercolor of Law hot take on the villainization of Michael Cohen. Michael Cohen's testimony has gotten underway, finally, in the Manhattan District Attorney's election interference case against former President Trump. Now, unsurprisingly to me, it sounds from reporting that Cohen's testimony began on a very solid footing. I'm not surprised because, as we have discussed earlier, the core parts of his story have never really wavered. And also, as we discussed earlier, the prosecution has done a good job of buffering his testimony with as much corroboration as possible, even before he gets on the stand. That leaves the cross-examination, which will be starting after the direct, with a pretty small target to hit, because he's essentially supported by all these documents, all these other witnesses, some of them Trump loyalists, that have already corroborated his story. What he needs to supply is a very small part of the story, and that's what they're going to try to zero in on, which is what is the one-on-one types of communications he had with Donald Trump. None of that surprising, quite expected. What is surprising to me is the uniform mad rush to characterize Cohen as a completely unreliable witness even before he took the stand. It has become standard now on the media to refer to him as a, quote, serial liar or a convicted liar. Now, while it may be true that he's been convicted, he has a conviction for perjury, there's a couple of reasons for this kind of emphasis on it. First, maybe it's an effort to drive up ratings, to make it more dramatic about whether or not the case against Trump is really strong. Now, really, no trial is ever a guaranteed win or loss, so we really don't need any extra disparagement of someone to make it more dramatic. It's plenty dramatic. Anyone who's ever waited for a jury to come back knows how dramatic it is. Second, it could also be an effort to do the both sides thing in an effort to make the coverage look fair. But there's a problem with that, too, as a matter of explaining trials to people. Problem with that is, by definition, that's what the trial already does. It shows both sides. The prosecution does its side. It gets to go first. Then the defense has cross-examination. They get to put on their case. So that is the both sides nature of it. Trying to do more both sides with political commentary, speculation, isn't that helpful. Because let's remember for a moment, what is our system of justice all about? What's it based on? At heart, a system of justice is meant to determine the truth, and we use attorneys to aid in that. Historically, it's always been very hard to have a system to discern the truth, to dispense justice. Other systems have included using torture. There's a system used famously in the witch trials where you dunk people in water. Now, I forget what the test was. If they floated, they were a witch, or if they sank, they were a witch. Not really sure. But a system like that, dunking in water, obviously has some random factors such as, does the accused know how to swim? What were they wearing? What might weight them down? You get the idea. So maybe not such an accurate system. Now, in our more supposedly enlightened progressive world, we've chosen this idea of two adversaries, the lawyers, who are like two white knights on chargers, jousting at each other. Whichever one of those knights, lawyers, wins, then we decide that their side must be on the side of the truth. Now, this system, although much more progressive than torture and drowning people, also has its flaws. For example, are both of the knights the same weight and height? Are their horses just as good? Are their lances the same length and as sharp? How good is each knight's training? You get the idea what the problems may be, and that's actually why there are structural inequities in the criminal justice system. But that is a different discussion. So, when we think about how our trial system actually works, which is these two adversaries coming at each other to determine the truth, we can see that the both sidism in the coverage is not that illuminating. Trying to give, quote, both sides coverage in order to make it seem like it's a fair coverage is redundant and actually distorts the coverage of the trial. It would be better to cover this very historic trial of course, with live audio or television. So thank you very much to the court systems for depriving the public of access to this. But without it, it's tough because the coverage has to depend a lot on literally people coming out or texting out what the dialogue has been, the colloquies on the stand. As a result, maybe a little too much discussion about speculating on motives, speculating on evidence that's not in the trial, and worst of all, is falling into Trump's talking points, which constantly conflates the legal issues, evidentiary issues, with political analysis. They aren't really related. But even taking into account these problems with our systems, with the coverage problems, still it strikes me that when it comes to Michael Cohen's testimony, the prejudgment is really at a frenzied state. I mean, take a look at this CNN headline. I think it puts it really well. No one has anything nice to say about Michael Cohen. No one. And so the prosecution has kind of played into that a little bit. They try to bring out from the other witnesses if they have negative opinions about him. That's a smart thing to do. But that kind of characterization is doing the public a little bit of a disservice because at this point, with everyone just constantly repeating this mantra, Cohen's a liar, he's a liar, no one even seems to remember what it is that he had lied about in the past, maybe why he lied about that. And that's going to be really critical in determining how credible he appears in this trial to the jury. Now, the trial is the Manhattan DA's election interference case against Trump, and it's based on the theory that Trump directed the falsification of business records to make the payment to Stormy Daniels to be quiet about their alleged sexual encounter. It was falsified because they tried to make it look like legal invoices instead of reimbursement. Point of all this was to help Trump's campaign suppress negative information. Michael Cohen was Trump's former lawyer. He was someone who had greatly looked up to Trump, and famously he said he would take a bullet for him. And he frequently lied for Trump, as he's testified before. He lied for Trump in testifying to Congress, telling Congress under oath, specifically, there had been no discussions with a Russian business project after June 2016. Why was that important? It was because after that, Trump had become the Republican nominee. In fact, there had been further discussions about that Russian business project, and Cohen was convicted for lying to Congress about that. He also lied about the payment to Stormy Daniels, and under the theory that it was further trying to help the campaign, and Cohen got convicted for campaign finance fraud. Those were two lies which resulted in convictions for him. He was convicted of lying to Congress. He was convicted for campaign finance violations. The other two convictions were one for bank fraud, lying about his income in order to get a $500,000 home equity loan, and the other was for income tax fraud, where he had underreported income. Sound familiar? There's a good argument maybe that there was a culture that he was working in that made this type of behavior a bit normal. I mean, recall that Trump and his organization were recently convicted of civil fraud for sort of whimsically increasing the value of properties, decreasing them, lying about their square footage, resulted in fines of some $400 million or more. And of course, Trump is also very famous for having bragged about paying zero income tax, despite the fact that he is a billionaire. So what's important about this is that 4 of Cohen's previous convictions arise from his lying, dishonesty, criminal acts in the service of Donald Trump. He was trying to help Trump, both with covering up a bad campaign issue, as well as trying to help Trump in having messaging before Congress that Trump had no business dealings with Russia after he became the Republican nominee. Those other 2 convictions, the bank fraud and the income tax, they probably never would have happened but for his value as a witness against Trump. That's because it's standard operating procedure for prosecutors to seek to leverage witnesses they think have good information to, quote, flip them against higher-ups. Michael Cohen was such a witness, a potential cooperator, and the higher-up was Donald Trump. To really appreciate what that meant, we have to understand what an unusually urgent, high-pressure situation it was back when Cohen came under this pressure. It's 2016, which seems like ancient history at this time. Only 100 days before the presidential election, the Obama Justice Department came into information that suggested some members of Trump's campaign team, his insiders, could be linked to Russia. A scenario which, if it was true, obviously would have posed a almost unprecedented Manchurian candidate kind of danger to our national security. It was in this highly pressured environment that DOJ and the FBI opened the investigation that was codenamed Crossfire Hurricane. It was an extremely close-held investigation that ultimately turned into Robert Mueller. Remember him? It turned into Robert Mueller's special counsel probe of, was there Russian interference? What was the Russian interaction with the Trump campaign? It was the Mueller team that referred to the DOJ, by that time led by a Trump-appointed group. Mueller reported the allegations about Cohen that led to those other charges, the bank fraud and the income tax fraud. It led to a search warrant on Cohen's office. Now, I can tell you from having worked at the Justice Department and having been a counsel to the Attorney General that a search warrant on a lawyer's office is greatly frowned upon. And the DOJ is very, very careful about doing something like that. To have authorized a search warrant on a lawyer's office, not just any lawyer, but one who had worked for the President of the United States, would have required sign-off at the highest levels of the department. The evidence would have had to have been very solid, necessitating such a search, and the career prosecutors, who are the backbone of the institution, would have had to strongly urge that this was a necessary thing to do. It possibly there would have been some debate there too. They might have had to sign off on it in spite of political objections from the political appointees at the department. Cohen was ultimately convicted of those. He pled guilty. And at sentencing for these convictions, what Mueller's team said to the judge at sentencing was noteworthy. They told the judge that Cohen had been truthful. And the DOJ, however, at that point, which prosecuted separately 2 charges of the income tax and bank fraud, they didn't agree. They told the judge that Cohen's cooperation of being helpful. Now, remember, Mueller is bringing one charge, which is the lying to Congress, and they gave the other charges to the DOJ. The judge felt Cohen needed to be made an example of, sentenced him to 3 years, and he served 13 and a half months in a federal prison, followed by a 1.5 years in home confinement. Unlike many other Trump insiders, Cohen was not pardoned by Trump. So this context is important to understand a couple things. First, it again shows the sort of pressure and technique that prosecutors use. One of Cohen's attorneys recently pointed out that Cohen had to make that decision about whether to take that guilty plea or not within the space of like a couple of days. They said, look, we're going to indict you. All these charges, including your wife, may get indicted, or you can take this plea deal. That is an enormous amount of pressure to put people under. It's done all the time. It's very strong-armed, very heavy-handed, and that's what prosecutors use on a witness to get them to cooperate. It's also important because it puts in context that the lies were demonstrably in service of Trump. And really, the other 2 convictions, the non-Trump related ones, only surfaced because of how important of a witness he was potentially against Trump. That's a very different picture than the one that's commonly being painted of calling him basically the world's worst sleazebag, someone who is a pathological liar, there's no context for that. It's not a question of whether he has ever lied or not. That needs to be brought out and considered by the jury. It's this idea of just writing him off as someone who's constantly lying, worst liar in history. Really, the kind of baggage that Cohen has, these convictions, having admitted to lied to help accomplish bad acts or crimes, that's very common baggage for a cooperating witness. That, again, seems to be something which has been forgotten by commentators and the media in their rush to paint Cohen as incredibly unreliable. The baggage Cohen carries is light. He's traveling light, or at least standard, well within the size and weight limits for carry-on luggage for a cooperator. So take a listen here to my colleague, Ellie Honig. Again, Ellie's very well-respected, very experienced state and federal prosecutor. Listen to his take on Cohen. I'll talk to you on the other side.
How much of this now rests on the shoulder, the successful prosecution, that rests on the shoulder of Michael Cohen?
I would say virtually all of it, Michael. And I want to say this. Michael Cohen is a unique witness, right? He has a history of lying unlike any witness that I've ever seen. He has a personal hatred for Donald Trump beyond what I've ever seen from any witness taking the stand against a defendant. I mean, 2 days ago, he did a video where he's wearing a goofy t-shirt showing Donald Trump in an orange jumpsuit behind bars. That's going to come back to haunt him.
Okay, again, I have great respect for Ellie, but to say that Cohen has a history of lying unlike any witness Ellie's ever seen, talk about hyperbole. So let's compare that to something that Ellie himself said a few years ago in his podcast promoting his book about his history of prosecuting the mob. So I'll read this to you. Quote, "Over the years, I, Ellie, worked with dozens of cooperating witnesses. I got good at flipping guys. I convinced a lot of them to come over and join Team America. Not all the time, but enough. There are few things as exciting to a mob prosecutor as flipping a new cooperating witness. For me, it was like getting a gift all nicely wrapped up, or opening a new pack of baseball cards as a kid. What am I going to get? What's inside here? And the best cooperators could open up a whole new world. Take you inside, tell you who's who got into what rackets, maybe even who killed who. And if the cooperator was really well positioned and really had the goods, he could bring down an entire crew, an entire wing of a mob family, as you'll see with today's guest, Michael Visconti." Who is Michael Visconti? That first guest was a known mob enforcer, obviously someone who had done quite a few bad things in their time. So it's a little hard to understand how a former prosecutor who's worked with violent mob witnesses, some people maybe who have even murdered others and became cooperators, nonetheless finds Michael Cohen to have a history of lying unlike any they've ever seen. So keep in mind also, there have been other examinations of Cohen's credibility and conclusions drawn about it. For example, Judge Engeron, in the civil fraud trial, stated that he found Cohen to be credible. And if you recall in that trial, there was pretty rough cross-examination, rough in a couple of ways. One, not that effective, and two, just very insulting towards Cohen by Trump lawyer Alina Abba. But it was successful testimony, and the judge thought he was credible. Also, Norm Eisen, who was the counsel for the House Judiciary Committee for the first Trump impeachment, he wrote in the CNN opinion piece that he had actually interviewed Cohen about these exact allegations, the campaign finance violation involving Stormy Daniels, and Eisen concluded that he believed Cohen. So, as we watch Cohen's testimony continue, we're likely to see the Manhattan DA's office's skill at working with a cooperating witness, something they probably do on a constant basis, daily, weekly. And we are already seeing the careful way that they prepared the jury for Cohen's testimony by the kind of evidence witnesses they put out. And we'll soon be seeing the careful results of their preparation of Cohen himself in the sense of how does he come across in both his direct and his cross-examination. Now, Cohen's no ordinary cooperator, not because of the extent of his lying or past convictions. That's common. He's no ordinary cooperator because of the historic nature of the trial. And this historic nature may someday also shape the way he's viewed in history. Normally, we often draw a distinction between so-called whistleblowers and cooperators. The cooperators tend to be viewed more as snitches, rats, and the whistleblowers are viewed as more noble people who had selfless motives for coming forth with information about bad things or crimes. It's not always true. As someone who's worked with both cooperating witnesses, informants, as well as whistleblowers, I can tell you, and history bears this out, that most whistleblowers will have some involvement in the original wrongdoing. Whether it be slight, maybe they observed it for a while and did nothing, or much more serious, they helped to enable it. In fact, helping to enable it makes them more valuable as a whistleblower because they really know the insider's view, the inside information. The very first whistleblowers in the American legal system came as early as the Revolutionary War, where naval officers reported to the Continental Congress the abuse of British prisoners of war. Now, they were considered whistleblowers, not cooperators. And really, how a person providing evidence is judged very much turns on how valuable or how bad of a wrongdoing has been exposed and how history eventually views that wrongdoing. There were many famous whistleblowers in American history. You might think about more modern versions, Karen Silkwood, talking about the nuclear dangers, Daniel Ellsberg with the Pentagon Papers. Again, it's a question of how history judges what they were doing. Now, Michael Cohen wrote a book called Revenge. That also gets a lot of play on the media because they think he's talking about how he wants to get revenge on Trump. It was actually a book about the way the Trump Justice Department was being used to extract vengeance or take vengeance on enemies of Donald Trump. Now, no doubt Cohen is angry at Trump. That's quite obvious why he would be. But any real revenge for Cohen? Well, it may be that if he helps secure the first conviction of a former president of the United States, that history is going to judge him in a far more favorable way than the media is characterizing him right now. History may even decide that what he did was a noble thing, even though he himself, years ago, working for Trump as Trump's enforcer and fixer, probably never would have envisioned such a role. But we'll see. That's it for now. I'm Shan Wu. Please follow me on Twitter at ShanWanWu and keep the comments coming. I really appreciate them. It's very helpful to hear. Talk to you soon.
Love this video? Make sure you stay up to date on the latest breaking news and all things Midas by signing up to the MeidasTouch newsletter at MeidasTouch.com/newsletter.